for anything Russia related. And of course, I'm talking about the Putin-Trump summit recently. But given what preceded the summit, the mainstream media's response could have been gauged a mile away. And what preceded the summit were Mueller's indictments. Now, something that I feel I should have pointed out in the last video, but I took it as a given when I really shouldn't have, is that an indictment doesn't mean that they have solid evidence. It's just an accusation. And at a time when Mueller's operation is being questioned so harshly, and Trump has this summit with Putin, Mueller has multiple motivations in front of him. Not to mention the motivations that I mentioned in my recent video, such as tying off the loose ends concerning the tall tale of Russia hacking Clinton in the DNC and the DCCC. And by an extension of that, it ties off the Seth Rich case. It doesn't actually conclude that case, but in the eyes of the public, it ties it off. I mean, there's still a lot of unanswered questions there. And the hack isn't settled yet either, because I think that it's completely possible that 12 Russia GRU agents tried to hack Clinton in the DCCC and the DNC. But the proof is what's lacking. And I'm sorry, but a private company investigating the hacked servers isn't good enough. And that was CrowdStrike, who has ties to many people involved with the Democrats, but specifically Eric Schmidt, who offered to work for Clinton's campaign. But anyways, Trump and Putin talked a lot about the indictments and the election meddling accusations. Luckily, Trump came away from it saying that the talk was direct, open, and deeply productive. He also said that the relationship between the US and Russia has never been worse, but this summit changed that. Putin called the summit successful and useful. And of course, when the discussion of election interference came up, he denied it. But it's not all that they discussed by any means. They also discussed the war in Syria, they discussed Iran, they discussed global terrorism, nuclear arms control. I mean, there was a lot on the docket. There were a lot of useful things. But then they had to discuss the election interference ordeal. And there'll be more to talk about when actual evidence is presented in that case, and the Russians indicted are finally charged. If they're charged. Because that's still an enormous point of speculation. Now, when it comes to their opening remarks to the media, both Trump and Putin had speeches that left me feeling like things are finally going in the right direction. Not necessarily as great as they could possibly be, but they're moving in the right direction. Trump said diplomacy and engagement are preferable to conflict and hostility. And he's very right, because saying that cyber attacks will be treated like any other attack and then framing a nuclear superpower for a cyber attack sounds like a good idea to some people, but not everyone. On another big note, the National Security Councils of the two countries will meet to follow up with agreements from the meeting. And Putin's comments included talk about Syria, a gas transit in the Ukraine, and him saying no one should trust anyone. But it's in the context of him saying Trump and him are both defending the interests of their own countries, and they're seeing the points where both of their interests line up. I mean, overall, I think it's idiotic to say that Trump is Putin's puppet. You have to know nothing about what Trump does and everything about what Trump says. And trust me, that's exactly what the mainstream media and the leftist alternative outlets will do when they're given the opportunity. It doesn't make sense to say that Trump is Putin's puppet because Trump said he wants a great relationship with Putin while he's killing Russian mercenaries in Syria. I mean, the media will say Trump is playing into Putin's hands as Trump is bombing Russian planes being kept at Syrian air bases. And did people magically forget about Trump selling arms to Ukraine to protect themselves from pro-Russian separatists in the eastern provinces? Those same people also magically forgot about how Obama handed Crimea over to Putin. But just ignore anything that doesn't fit the narrative. And the best part of all of this was Mattis's response to questions about whether or not this would stoke tensions. And Mattis's response was that defensive weapons are not provocative unless you're an aggressor. And clearly, Ukraine is not an aggressor since it's their own territory where the fighting is happening. And playing devil's advocate with this, because I just had to, I dug and I dug and I dug until I found this story from Newsweek pointing out that 35 Javelin anti-tank launchers were sent to Ukraine on April 30th of this year. It was in the first couple of days of May that the Ukraine's prosecutor said no subpoenas will be issued and no witnesses interviewed for the Mueller case, even though the cases hadn't been closed. So the implication is that Trump gave them weapons so that they'd refuse to further comply with Mueller's probe. And the only issue that I have with this is that, the facts are real, but the implication is where you lose me, because I think if the motivating factor behind selling arms to the Ukraine is to get them to stop complying with Mueller's team, then it wouldn't take well over 4 months. They'd be streamlining this to get it done ASAP. And yes, maybe 4 months is ASAP, but the legislation became law 3 years ago. So the long and lengthy parts of the process are already completed. I don't see any reason that this should have taken so long if the purpose was to cast a wrench into Mueller's probe. But if the purpose was elsewhere, perhaps political power, then timing plays into it. And there's no huge rush for the arms to get to the Ukraine. So that's my take on this whole summit. And something that people need to keep in mind with Trump especially is what I mentioned earlier. What he says and what he does, it doesn't always line up perfectly every time. In fact, sometimes it may be nowhere close to the same. But what matters to those who can read beyond headlines and single out of context quotes is the policy that's enacted as a result of it. And that's where Trump shines. He might talk in a flippant manner about something, but it doesn't mean that he takes the policy writing in the same fashion. His history of passing useful legislation like those that combat child trafficking and open up our trade options and enforce our border laws, those are all fantastic. And there's many more. He's passed a huge amount of legislation, and I'm sure that I'm forgetting something huge, but nonetheless, we need to wait to really see what comes out of this meeting. I'm hopeful that there will be mutually beneficial agreements reached and growing trade options between the countries, but we'll really have to see. So that's all for this video. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you haven't, donation, Patreon.